all eyes are on China as the country's second largest property developer, Evergrande, is at risk of defaulting on a $300 billion loan. Their failure would devastate China's economy and could potentially lead to financial pain in the global markets as well. Today, I'm going to cover how Evergrande got itself into this predicament, what the Chinese government's response will likely be, and whether or not this could affect the US economy. But first, do me a favor and obliterate that like button for me and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. Evergrande was founded in 1996 by Chinese billionaire, and forgive me if I butcher this, Zhu Jiayin. It is incorporated in the Cayman Islands, the mother of all tax havens. They mainly focus their efforts on residential construction and selling apartments to middle to upper class families. The company owns more than 1,300 projects in more than 280 cities. Evergrande has also invested in other operations such as theme parks, a soccer team, bottled water, and other ventures. It is for this reason that some critics have claimed that the company has stretched themselves too thin. In any case, part of the reason why Evergrande was able to grow to such a tremendous size is because of the cultural significance of owning a home in China. About 90% of Chinese citizens own a home compared to about 65% of US citizens. This makes the real estate industry an incredibly lucrative business to become a part of. In order to continue developing real estate, Evergrande took on a $300 billion loan from banks, institutional investors, and even some average homebuyers that were looking for a good deal on real estate. This method has worked in the past since valuations of real estate in China have been very kind to developers, but after the pandemic started, that all changed. As you'd imagine, operations were delayed significantly, prices for materials skyrocketed, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to find labor. Needless to say, Evergrande was Investors still expected for their interest to be paid in full, just like their contracts were structured. They care little about exigent circumstances that would make it difficult for those payments to be made. For example, the cost of goods increased by nearly 300% this year, and properties were not even completely finished due to those labor shortages. For this reason, in June, Evergrande warned their investors that they may not be able to make their next payment, and that they were working tirelessly to restructure their debts to stay afloat. Fast forward to September, and it was clear that there was a huge problem with Evergrande and that government intervention would likely be necessary. China let investors know that Evergrande wouldn't pay their next interest payment and that they would be renegotiating the terms of their contracts. Last Thursday, it was reported that investors holding Evergrande debt with a value of more than $2 billion did not receive their interest payments that were due. Ultimately, the company will be forced to sell their buildings to increase their liquidity, but that leads to another issue. Evergrande was and still is in limbo. They don't have the money or resources to finish their half-built projects. It is also highly unlikely that someone would invest in a half-built property for fear of a loss in value. Furthermore, Evergrande's stock has dropped about 85% and the company owes tens of thousands of people money. Worse yet, nearly 1 million Chinese buyers that have already submitted a down payment on an unfinished apartment could wind up losing everything that they paid for. So now that you understand how Evergrande became so ridiculously saddled with debt, let's talk about the Chinese government's response. Due to its massive size, if Evergrande were to fail, this could collapse the Chinese economy and harm global markets. This is why the company has been compared to the collapse of the Lehman Brothers during the 2008 housing crisis. However, it is worth noting that the $300 billion that are owed by Evergrande is roughly half of the debt that Lehman had when filing for bankruptcy. China is also a communist/capitalist country, so their way of handling the crisis may be different than that of the US. In any case, it appears that the Chinese government has begun to intervene. They have very few options, and none of them are particularly good. The first option Xi Jinping has is to simply allow for Evergrande to fail. This would send a strong message to financial institutions that the same rules apply to them and that the too big to fail ideology would not be acceptable. Unfortunately, this would be devastating to the Chinese economy and millions would suffer as a result. I would argue that the second option is much more likely. Jinping will probably bail out Evergrande, but they are not going to make it easy for them. In other words, the company will suffer for quite some time and have to sell the majority of their assets for a fraction of their cost just to pay off their monumental debts. In the end, this choice will be necessary to protect the thousands of citizens that have just purchased unfinished apartments. Last week, the People's Bank of China injected about 460 billion yuan or $69 billion into their financial system to help boost their short-term liquidity and settle investor worries. But even with these injections, it may already be too late to save the company. So how might this affect the US economy? Well, the short answer is that it probably won't. The US company with the largest ownership of Evergrande is BlackRock. BlackRock is the largest asset management company in the world and owns pretty much everything. Thus, their performance in the stock market would affect all of the companies that it has ownership in. And if you own any stocks right now, you probably have exposure to BlackRock. However, they currently hold $385 million worth of Evergrande bonds, which is a minuscule 0.004% of their $9.5 trillion under management today. Now, that isn't to say that we won't see the S&P 500 dip if Evergrande were to default on their loans. The general sentiment is that things have been going far too well in the US stock market, so I wouldn't be surprised if this crisis would be the catalyst to spark a correction. Please do your own research though prior to making any financial decisions. And that's it. This was a short one since I didn't want to get too far into the weeds, but thanks for watching and feel free to like and subscribe if you learned anything new. Cheers!